I'm a proud USGLC member, and it's always so exciting to be at this event. I am really pleased to announce our next session. Many of you in the room here were with us last December on World AIDS Day, as USGLC was proud to honor President George W. Bush and Mrs. Bush for their extraordinary leadership in launching PEPFAR 20 years ago today. But they didn't do it alone. The launch of PEPFAR in 2003 came after years of tireless advocacy and leadership from the Congressional Black Caucus and Congresswoman Barbara Lee to bolster America's response to HIV and AIDS globally. This year, as PEPFAR marks its 20th anniversary of delivering this unprecedented impact in the global fight against HIV and AIDS, we couldn't have a more impressive panel for you to hear today. Congresswoman Barbara Lee has been a leading foreign policy voice in Congress for decades and has built a well-deserved reputation as one of the fiercest champions of America's global leadership, where she serves as ranking member of State Foreign Operations Subcommittee. Congresswoman Lee was one of the original architects of PEPFAR, so it's going to be a great honor to listen to her today as she talks about working with President Bush to launch the transformative program. But you know, her accomplishments just go on, from empowering women and girls to preventing violence and conflict, promoting human rights, strengthening international partnerships, fighting global poverty and hunger. She really is at the forefront of what USGLC is all about. So it's going to be a treat to listen to her today. You're also going to listen to Ambassador John Nkangasong, who is a leading virologist with over 30 years of experience in public health. He was the first director of the Africa CDC, serving on the boards of the International AIDS Vaccine and CPI, and as a World Health Organization Special Envoy for COVID-19. Today, he leads, manages, and oversees PEPFAR in his role as the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator. We will also be joined by former Congresswoman Ilana Ross-Lehtinen, who served for 3 decades as a member of Congress, representing Florida's 27th District. At the time she left office, she was Florida's most senior representative. During her tenure in Congress, she was a champion of foreign policy, serving as Chairwoman Emeritus of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Chairwoman of the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa. She's been a distinguished member of USGLC's Florida Advisory Committee since her retirement from Congress in 2019. Deborah Tellman will be our other panelist, who currently serves as the Executive Vice President of Corporate Affairs and General Counsel for Gilead. Prior to joining Gilead, Deborah served as Executive Vice President at Organagon, a women's healthcare company. And this conversation is going to be moderated by Rosalind Brock, Chief Global Equity Officer for Abbott Associates and Chair Emeritus of the NAACP. Please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Congresswoman Deborah Lee will be here shortly. She's in transit, and so we'll welcome her to the stage when she comes. Let's get started. I'm going to have a conversation this afternoon about reflections of PEPFAR at 20. So as we all know, PEPFAR has been transformative in many, many ways. And it's been characterized as one of the best examples of global health leadership in our history. Some of its successes over the last 2 decades have been that over 25 million lives have been prevented from HIV and AIDS, and 5.5 million transitions in children. And over 340,000 healthcare workers have been trained. 65 million people are receiving HIV and AIDS training services, and more than 2% increase in the GDP per capita in partner countries. But beyond this impact, we must also recognize how it has changed global health and development program delivery and dissemination forever. Our nation's response to other global health threats like Ebola, H1N1, and COVID-19 have been impacted. It's also created new ways to think about public-private partnerships and raise the importance of transparency, accountability, and results-driven impact. I'm going to start and ask my first question to you, Ambassador Kangason. Last year, you released a new strategy to end HIV and AIDS as a public health threat by 2030. Despite PEPFAR's incredible progress, 38 million people remained living with HIV and AIDS. Can you talk about why PEPFAR is so essential as it was 20 years ago as it is today?
Thank you so much. And let me start by expressing my sincere appreciation for the global leadership for inviting me to speak today. This is a year of celebration of PEPFAR. I think we always have to pause, look back where we're coming from, and project where we are going to. You nicely outline some of the remarkable achievements that PEPFAR has achieved over the last 20 years. PEPFAR, to me, represents the best of humanity when we apply ourselves appropriately and right. And PEPFAR represents where the good intersection between good politics and good public health implementation leads to millions of lives saved, 25 million lives saved. When I took this, when the president nominated me as a candidate for the position I'm currently serving, I was at the African Union, serving as the first founding director of the Centers for Disease Control, which is an initiative that was supported by the US government after the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And several ambassadors came to me and said, the African Union ambassadors came to me, they grabbed my hand and they said, we know what PEPFAR is. PEPFAR represents to us, to them, American people and African people. PEPFAR represented to them American values in their communities where they saw it firsthand. So because of that, Dr. John, as they call me, will let you go. Remember, this was in the middle of the COVID response, so it was very, very difficult to make that transition. But because of what PEPFAR has done, because of the results, the enormity of the results that you just outlined, the whole continent of Africa remains appreciative of that. It offered hope at a time where there was hopelessness, where people were helpless, where we saw nothing in the streets lining that stretch of road between Entebbe and Kampala, nothing other than coffins. You saw a big coffin, a smaller coffin, a smaller coffin. The coffin market was thriving. You saw human beings that were skeleton of the people on a thin skin over their dry bones. Today, because of the transformative nature of PEPFAR, that is no longer the case. 25 million people saved, 5.5 million children born free of HIV infection. That is something we must celebrate.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Congresswoman Ross Latham, PEPFAR's legacy is uniquely bipartisan, led by advocates in the Congressional Black Caucus and supported by President George W. Bush, and passed by a Republican-led Congress. What is it about PEPFAR that makes it so uniquely bipartisan? And can you talk about the support of Congress for PEPFAR among Republicans?
Well, thank you so much, Rosalind. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you to all the ladies and gentlemen of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. It's impossible to say no to Liz and to Jason, so I just learned, just say yes before. And Ambassador, it's always a thrill. And Deb, who represents Gilead, a life-saving company, is doing incredible research. And just as PEPFAR is saving lives. They're providing the medicines to save those lives. And I had the honor of participating in a ceremony, I don't know, was it just a few months ago with President George W. Bush? And I am so proud of that lasting legacy that President Bush has. And when he's visited Africa, the people come up to him and they hug him and they dance with him. And it's as you say in your very introduction, it's transformative. This is a program that, you know, since World War II, since the Marshall Plan, has been the program that has been the most successful bipartisan program of foreign policy ever. So it makes America look good to be helping so many people. That is a good look for us. So many things divide us, so many things. It's so toxic in Washington, but here's something that both parties can look at and say, we've got to reauthorize PEPFAR this year. There is no next year, so let's work together. There's going to be a lot of issues, difficult issues. Deb knows it, the ambassador knows it, but we can all work together with the leadership of the U.S. Global Coalition to make this reauthorization a reality this year.
Thank you. You know, I think I did a misstep when I said Deborah Lee, because I was thinking about my colleague Deborah Tillman, Barbara Lee. But let's move to talk about public-private partnerships. They're so critical for any large-scale successful programming. And as you know, USGLC recently took a group of senior political strategists and leaders to Kenya to show them the impact of America's global leadership on the ground. Can you tell us about why Gilead has collaborated with PEPFAR on partnerships including DREAMS and MNSTAR?
No, thank you for that question. And first, let me say thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel and to be a part of this really important discussion around HIV and to celebrate PEPFAR's 20th anniversary. I'm really pleased to be here. And I was struck by Ambassador's comments in the picture he painted of what's happening on the continent in terms of the number of coffins that they had to deal with and how that's been reduced. And I really appreciate your comments in terms of the bipartisan approach. And at Gilead, it's really important for us as an ethos to be bold. And we know reducing or eliminating HIV epidemic for everyone everywhere is our goal. And we also know that partnerships is also important. We couldn't just take our innovative therapies and bring them to market unless we could partner with organizations like PEPFAR, community advocates. So as a part of how we're trying to solve the HIV epidemic and eradicate it, we have to work together. And I think PEPFAR is an excellent example of that private-public partnership. But we also know that the HIV infection rate has dropped, but is disproportionately impacted on women and adolescents. So we know there's more work to be done in that space, in that area. And when PEPFAR talked to Gilead back in 2014 and said, how do we work together between us in terms of our innovative therapies and the community reach that PEPFAR has, it made sense for us to partner and to work together around the DREAMS, which is really a program where we're trying to help women, adolescent women and girls on the continent to make sure we understand what are those structural barriers to getting them life-saving medicines. So Gilead donated some PrEP medication, but we also worked with our partners to really understand what those barriers are. And we know what they are. They're being disadvantaged economically, lack of education, and we also know it's the sex-based violence that women have. So taking all that together, we came up and promoted and were helpful with the DREAMS, where we have the young girls and women as their own ambassadors. Because we also know that it's important for communities to talk to communities, to hear their concerns and to reach out and make a connection. So we're thrilled that it's really catalyzed having more ambassadors in country. And then we also know, men in terms of how do we make sure that they adhere to the medicine, they also receive education. And we started a WhatsApp app called Men Connect in South Africa that helps with that information and adherence. So there's so many ways that we want to continue to partner, and I'm happy to continue to have this discussion today on this panel.
Thanks so much, Deborah. Well, the importance of coming to conferences like this, particularly for the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, it's about timely information and about education and awareness. So, ripped from the headlines of Politico, a top Republican has thrown PEPFAR reauthorization into doubt. So, Ambassador, Congressman, can you give your thoughts on that for us?
I think we started this dialogue looking back at the catastrophic nature of what HIV was, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. We also have profiled the remarkable success that PEPFAR has achieved so far. And PEPFAR has done that by respecting and obeying the laws that guided PEPFAR's implementation strictly. I think to be totally transparent, some of the conversation, the challenging discussions we've been having these last couple of weeks is that PEPFAR offers a platform for abortion in Africa, which is absolutely not the case. PEPFAR has never, will not, ever use that platform in supporting abortion. PEPFAR is implemented strictly within the context of the laws that it was created. I will leave it at that. I think at this juncture, we owe it to ourselves to be totally honest, to be totally transparent with what we do. I, as the coordinator, have taken a commitment, and today I'm issuing a letter to all PEPFAR implementing partners and in the field to remind ourselves of our responsibility that we have to implement PEPFAR, make sure that it is a data-driven, science, evidence-based, and following the laws that created PEPFAR.
Thank you so much for that clarification. So, I've got another question for you. What has PEPFAR meant to communities across Africa with respect to HIV and AIDS treatment?
Let me just say this before I answer that question. We have cleaned the ugly face of HIV/AIDS. The picture that I just painted, a skinny adult with dry bones, with a thin skin underneath their body, coffin market thriving, the economy is diving, life expectancy decreasing to about 28 years across many sub-Saharan African countries. So, but HIV/AIDS is not gone. Last year alone, there were 1.5 million new cases of HIV/AIDS, new cases of HIV/AIDS. 650,000 people died of HIV/AIDS, of which about 425,000 were in sub-Saharan Africa. Compare that to about 250,000 people who died of COVID in 3 years in Africa. So 1 year alone, 425,000 people. For the communities in Africa, PEPFAR represents hope. Hope for the individual, hope for the family, and hope for the community. Imagine for 1 second, and I'll end there so that we think about it, that we lift our foot off the pedal, and the 20 million people that are receiving life-saving treatment within 1 year will die. Because it takes you only 23 to 24 days for virus to emerge once you stop taking that drug every day. So if you stop it, I guarantee you more than 20 million people will die in Africa within a very short period of time.
I appreciate that. I was looking at an interview that you did a couple weeks ago, and you said when the people in Africa think about the PEPFAR program, they think that America cares,
Yes.
that America cares.
Yeah.
And that's so powerful for the work that we're doing. Deborah, let me turn to you. To date, Gilead has invested deeply in organizations around the world that have been tackling HIV on the ground. What is the next phase of technology and innovation that you believe will strengthen the efforts in tackling HIV?
Now, So innovation is so important in this space, and we all remember the time where someone had to take a bunch of pills to today when they could take one. So that's an example of innovation. But we know, again, in order to be bold and to end the HIV epidemic for everyone everywhere, we've got to move beyond that. We have to take a person-centered approach. What works for women? What works for young girls? You know, what works for this population? So we think about that in terms of the next phase, in terms of long-acting PrEP medication. Should it be monthly, weekly, every 3 months? It depends on the person, and we need to talk to community advocates to understand what that population needs. So that's something that we talk about constantly within Gilead. How do we meet the patients where they need us to be in terms of ending the HIV epidemic? But we also know that it's not just, again, the therapies, but we have to have a better understanding of those structural barriers that are not allowing populations to have access to this medication. And we spend a lot of time thinking about stigma. You know, how do we deal with that? In the US, we have a whole campaign about stigma in the southern United States. That probably is the same thing in outside of the US. So we have to work in collaboration with the scientists as they bring those innovative medicines, but also community organizations to make sure we understand where we want to be, how do we get that access, what are those comorbidities that, you know, women may face as they take medication. So we need to have all of those conversations to make sure that we understand where the person is and meet them there.
Thank you. Congresswoman, you've been instrumental, you were instrumental with Congresswoman Lee in establishing PEPFAR. And you have said that, quote, it has been one of your most or best achievements in Congress. So as former chairwoman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, what is it about PEPFAR that has made you so proud, and why did you feel it was so important? Or what are those things that you think should happen to lead towards reauthorization?
Well, thank you so much, and I agree with what my fellow panelists have said, Rosalind, and especially the ambassador when he said PEPFAR means hope. Hope, especially for the continent of Africa, for all of those residents. And I am so proud to have been associated with the PEPFAR program since its inception. I don't think that we knew that it would be as successful and as transformational, as life-changing as it has been. It is truly a remarkable American success story that we have shared with the world, because we didn't just want to save Americans from HIV/AIDS. We wanted to save generations of children throughout the world. So we talk a lot about Africa, but it's just one example of the many places where PEPFAR has been a resounding success. And so much is being talked about of cutting programs, of waste, fraud, and abuse. Yet what every study that has been done on PEPFAR, on the effectiveness of the program, on how the dollars are being used, it has come up with roses. It is a program where maybe it's the ambassador who's been doing it, I don't know, who's been in charge of making sure that there are no terrible stories about PEPFAR funding, but there's a lot that you kind of hang your head in shame saying, oh, how did this happen? But PEPFAR, oh, and here's the mother, the mother of PEPFAR. She deserves a standing ovation. I don't even need to finish my sentence. Barbara and I started the HIV AIDS caucus, and wow, you're Deb Tillman of Gilead. And I'm going to shut up, Rosalind. I'm going to send it back to you. You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them. I'm folding them. The mother of PEPFAR.
Yes, yes.
You've been called the mother of PEPFAR, and we've been waiting for you.
So, apologize.
No,
you know,
no
being on the
worries.
hill and not knowing if votes are going to happen.
Yeah.
Yes, they are. No, they aren't. Yes, they are. And then coming.
Paralyzed.
Oh my
Oh,
God.
boy.
Yeah, your voice
Glad to be here.
Your voice is so important to this conversation. So take a breath. So what we like to know from you in your own words, you've been largely responsible, you and Congresswoman Ross Leflin, of bringing PEPFAR to life in partnership with Bush administration and the Congressional Black Caucus. Tell us your thoughts. Why is it so critical? Why is it so important?
Well, first, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Dr. John, and to all of you who are really keeping hope alive in many respects, because we are at a critical turning point as it relates to PEPFAR. Just a bit of history. I formerly worked for the late Congressman Ron Dellums, and when I was elected in you remember Ron, 98, we talked about what was taking place as it relates to HIV and AIDS and came up with what we called an African sort of fund to address HIV and AIDS. And that ultimately evolved into the Global Fund. Chairman Leach, I was on the banking committee, and we figured that it would be better to bring it through the banking committee because of the politics of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I was on the banking committee. And so we were able to establish the framework for the Global Fund for as the fiscal agent through the World Bank. And so we got that signed into law by Bill Clinton. And then, of course, Kofi Annan and the United Nations helped put it all together. And so that was my first bill, really, that got PEPFAR going, because that was the Global Fund. Then we moved toward, when President Bush was elected, I wanted to keep going in terms of a bilateral effort. And what we did was, when he was elected, the Black Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, then it was led by Eddie Bernice Johnson, who he knew very well from Texas. We had a meeting with President Bush. And I wore, because Congressman Dellums was working with Bristol Myers Squibb at that point and was helping raise money for care and treatment for those in Africa who were dying each and every day of AIDS. And there were these beaded buttons with a red button with a red ribbon in the middle. And so I wore that to the meeting, and I asked Congresswoman, Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, if I could bring up the whole global HIV/AIDS issue. Bottom line is, she said, yeah, go for it. Nobody else around the table was bringing it up, so I did. And then I think it was Condoleezza Rice and Secretary Powell were both in the room, and he turned to them and asked them to follow up and to talk with me, and let's talk about this further. So then afterwards, we were in a photo line, and I'll never forget this, because I saw President Bush a few months ago and reminded him of this, but he saw on my chest here, the button, the ribbon, it was beaded, and he asked me about it. And I took it off and I gave it to him, and I was telling him the story about how ruthless HIV and AIDS was, and taking the lives of so many. And I'd been to Africa with Sandy Thurman, and during the Clinton administration, been looking at the children in Africa who were dying, their teachers, their parents, seeing the coffins being built. They couldn't build enough coffins to bury the people. I mean, it was devastating what I saw in 98, 99. So I explained all of that to President Bush. And fast forward, we started working together on PEPFAR. It wasn't called PEPFAR, but it was the framework for what ended up being PEPFAR. And finally, that December, before the announcement was made, things were moving a little slowly, so I asked every member of the Black Caucus to sign a letter to President Bush to say, look, this should be in your State of the Union. You should mention something about this initiative that we're working on. And voila, he did. John Bolton was in the White House then. And so we had a very cordial, even though we disagreed on everything, we had a very cordial relationship, because we both agreed on PEPFAR and that what we had to do to save lives. And from that day forward, I was on by then the Foreign Affairs Committee with Henry Hyde and Tom Lantos, and they were good friends, but here comes Barbara Lee, right? Democrat, progressive Barbara Lee wanted to get PEPFAR passed. And they worked with me, and I worked with them, and we got it over the finish line. And during the committee markup, there were some critical points, where we are now. There were some who wanted to blow it up, because the agreements that we had made about certain issues, such as a conscience clause and, the whole reproductive rights issue, and we had agreed on certain provisions, and then there were some members who went back in many ways on that agreement. And so I was about ready. And I tell you, this is one thing that I always thought about, because all of the Democrats were going to follow me and some of the Republicans, and I was about ready to vote no because of the way some members were trying to blow it up. Instead, I said, okay, this is too important to take it down. So I voted yes, and then got a commitment to work on the issues later on as we move forward. So I'm glad I did, because now we have saved over 25 million lives, and we're up now for reauthorizing it this year. We want to get it done in this summer, and we don't want, because 85% of members of Congress who are serving today were not here when PEPFAR was introduced. They don't understand the bipartisan nature of PEPFAR. And so we have, and hopefully you'll help us educate members of Congress about its importance, but also about not opening it up. We want an extension of 5 years, maybe with a couple of technical changes. But there's some who want to blow it up, open it up, which is going to make it more difficult to reauthorize it. And so you know what I'm talking about, right? So I would encourage all of you to let's stay the course. We've got to get this through the finish line. It's got to be bipartisan, and we will achieve an AIDS-free generation by 2030 if we stay the course. So thank you again.
So our time is getting short, and so I'm going to ask each of you the same question. I'm going to start with you, Deb, and then we will come towards me. Congresswoman Lee has shared with us the past, but as we look to the future, with all the successes that PEPFAR has had in its programming, what gives you hope that PEPFAR's transformative impact can continue into the future?
I would say, just based on what the Congresswoman just said, the bipartisan nature of what we've accomplished, and that it gives people hope. The fact that we can work with industry in order to deliver that hope. And there's so many people in this room who are committed to eradicating HIV. That gives me hope that I know we're going to do it. And history tends to repeat itself, unfortunately. So we'll tend to have more, discussion about what's in the bill. But I'm confident that it'll be reauthorized because it's the right thing to do.
And I am confident as well. Yes, there are some difficult hurdles, but we've been there before, and we have, through great legislators like Barbara Lee, have managed to surf our way through all of these problems. And just like Deb is able to do it with Gilead, with public-private partnerships, just like the ambassador has been able to articulate the need to make this a bipartisan, keep it as a bipartisan bill, and Barbara's leadership, I remain committed that we've got soldiers on the ground, all of you of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, that we're going to unleash you onto Capitol Hill tomorrow, and you're going to tell them, we need this bill reauthorized, we need it now, we can't wait for next year, and we can smooth out all of those problems mañana. But now, we've got to pass it. Ambassador and Barbara?
No, absolutely. Congresswoman, before you came, I started off by saying good politics plus good public health practice save lives. I remain positive that our country, by doing PEPFAR, represented the best of our values. And I remain hopeful that that bipartisan spirit, even though difficult, will always prevail. That is my hope.
So, Congresswoman, you have the closing word on that.
Yay.
Well,
Rally the troops here, Barbara.
Ileana and I established the Bipartisan HIV/AIDS Caucus, and I want to thank you because that framework is still bipartisan with Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon, and it's working. And so thank you for your leadership and really being able to see beyond the politics of what then was taking place and now, of course, what's taking place. But I'll just close by saying I met the first individual who received PEPFAR funding, who received the benefits and the treatment and the care from PEPFAR. I met him, his name, I believe, was John Roberts in Uganda. And this was way back in the day. And he came up to me. I was with the delegation sponsored by CARE. And he came up to me, and they wanted me to meet him because they said, this is the very first beneficiary of PEPFAR. He is a school teacher, he has 5 kids, and he's doing great. And I tell you, that day said it all for me. So that's why we have to keep at it.
Hey. Those were wonderful closing words. We wish we had more time to really talk about the importance of PEPFAR, but our work happens tomorrow. Congresswoman Ross Leffler has given us the charge, as has Congresswoman Lee, also Ambassador Nakongan, and also Deborah Tellman. Now the future is in your hands as you go tomorrow to have conversations. Let's give this panel a big, big round of applause. Thank you so much, because I think thank you. I think what you've heard from all of them is the importance of expertise, diplomacy, infrastructure, and strategic partnerships, and how working through a strong bipartisan support, you can change the future for generations yet unborn. We can have a better tomorrow. So thank you all for the work that you have done as we celebrate PEPFAR 20 years in the making. Thanks so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.